Chapter 1. The front door opened, and I heard the stamp of the FBI agent's feet on the doormat. It had just begun to snow, and the air that rushed into the store was heavy and brimming with energy. The door shut behind the agent. She must have been just outside when she'd called, because it had only been about 5 minutes since I'd agreed to meet with her. Except for me, the store was empty. I don't know exactly why I'd opened it that day. A storm was forecast to drop over 2 feet of snow, beginning in the morning and continuing through until the following afternoon. Boston Public Schools had already announced they were closing early, and they'd canceled all classes for the following day. I'd called the 2 employees who were scheduled to come in, Emily for the morning shift and early afternoon, and Brandon for the afternoon and evening, and told them both to stay home. I logged on to the Old Devil's Bookstore Twitter account and was about to send out a tweet saying that we were closed for the duration of the storm, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the thought of spending all day in my apartment alone. And besides, I lived less than half a mile from the store. I decided to go in. At the very least, I'd be able to spend some time with Nero, straighten up some shelves, maybe even pack up some online orders. A sky the color of granite was threatening snow as I unlocked the front doors on Berry Street in Beacon Hill. Old Devil's Bookstore is not in a high-traffic area, but we're a specialty bookstore. Mystery books, used and new, and most of our customers seek us out or simply order directly from our website. On a typical Thursday in February, I wouldn't be surprised if the total number of customers barely reached double digits. Unless, of course, we had an event planned. Still, there was always work to do. And there was Nero, the store cat who hated spending the day alone. Also, I couldn't remember if I'd fed him extra food the night before. It turned out I probably hadn't, because when I stepped through the front door, he came racing along the hardwood floor to greet me. He was a ginger cat of indeterminate age, perfect for the store because of his willingness, his eagerness, really, to put up with the affections of strangers. I turned on the store lights, fed Nero, then brewed myself a pot of coffee. At 11, Margaret Lum, a regular, entered. "What are you doing open?" she asked. "What are you doing out?" She held up 2 grocery bags from an upscale grocery store on Charles Street. "Provisions," she said in her patrician voice. We talked about the latest Louise Penny novel. She talked, mostly. I pretended I'd read it. These days I pretend I've read many books. I do read the reviews from the major trade publications, of course, and I go to a few blogs. One of them is called The Armchair Spoiler, and it includes reviews of recent titles that discuss endings. I no longer have the stomach for contemporary mystery novels. Sometimes I reread a particular favorite from my childhood, and I find the book blogs indispensable. I suppose I could be honest, tell people that I've lost interest in mystery novels, that I primarily read history these days, poetry, before I go to bed, but I prefer to lie. The few people I've told the truth to always want to know why I've given up reading crime, and it's not something I can talk about. I sent Margaret Lum away with a used copy of Ruth Rendell's Shake Hands Forever that she was 90% sure she'd never read. Then I ate the lunch I'd packed, a chicken salad sandwich, and was just about thinking of calling it a day when the phone rang. "Old Devil's Bookstore," I answered. "Is Malcolm Kershaw available?" A woman's voice. "Speaking," I said. "Oh, good. This is Special Agent Gwen Mulvey of the FBI. I'd love a little bit of your time to ask you a few questions." "Okay," I said. "Is now good?" "Sure," I said, thinking she wanted to talk on the phone, but instead she told me she'd be right over and disconnected the line. I stood for a moment, phone in hand, imagining what an FBI agent named Gwen would look like. Her voice on the phone had been raspy, so I imagined her to be nearing retirement, an imposing, humorless woman in a tan raincoat. A few minutes later, Agent Mulvey pushed through the door, looking very different from how I'd imagined her. She was in her 30s, if that, and wearing jeans that were tucked into forest green boots, plus a puffy winter jacket and a white knit hat with a pom-pom on it. She stomped her boots on the welcome mat, removed her hat, and came across to the checkout counter. I came around to meet her, and she reached out a hand. She had a firm handshake, but her hand was clammy. "Agent Mulvey?" I asked. "Yes, hi." Snowflakes were melting on her green coat, leaving behind dark spots. She briefly shook her head. The ends of her thin blonde hair were wet. "I'm surprised you're still open," she said. "I'm just about to close up, actually." "Oh," she said. She had a leather bag slung over one shoulder, and she lifted the strap over her head, then unzipped her jacket. "You have some time, though?" "I do, and I'm curious. Should we talk back in my office?" She turned back and glanced at the front door. The tendons in her neck popped out against her white skin. "Will you be able to hear if a customer comes in?" she said. "I don't think that'll happen, but yes, I'll be able to hear. It's this way." My office was more of a nook at the back of the store. I got Agent Mulvey a chair and went around the desk and sat in my leather recliner, its stuffing bulging out from the seams. I positioned myself so that I could see her between two stacks of books. "I'm sorry," I said. "I forgot to ask if you wanted anything. There's still some coffee in the pot." "No, I'm fine," she said, removing her jacket and putting her leather bag, more of a briefcase, really, on the floor by her side. She wore a black crewneck sweater under the coat. Now that I could really see her, I realized it wasn't just her skin that was pale. It was all of her. The color of her hair, her lips, her eyelids, almost translucent. Even her glasses with their thin wire rims almost disappeared into her face. It was hard to know exactly what she looked like, almost like some artist had rubbed a thumb across her features to blur them. "Before we start, I'd like to ask you to please not discuss anything we are about to talk about with anyone. Some of it is public record, but some of it is not." "Now I'm really curious," I said, aware that my heart rate had accelerated. "And yes, absolutely, I won't tell anyone." "Great, thank you," she said, and she seemed to settle in her chair, her shoulders dropping, her head squaring with mine. "Have you heard about Robin Callahan?" she asked. Robin Callahan was a local news anchor who, a year and a half ago, had been found shot in her home in Concord, about 25 miles northwest of Boston. It had been the leading local news story since it had happened, and despite a suspicious ex-husband, no arrests had been made. "About the murder?" I said. "Of course." "And what about J. Bradshaw?" I thought for a moment, then shook my head. "I don't think so." "He lived in Dennis on the Cape. In August, he was found beaten to death in his garage." "No," I said. "You sure?" "I'm sure." "Then what about Ethan Bird?" "That name rings a bell." "He was a college student from UMass Lowell who went missing over a year ago." "Okay, right." I did remember this case, although I couldn't remember any of the details. "He was found buried in a state park in Ashland, where he was from, about 3 weeks after he'd gone missing." "Yeah, of course. It was big news." "Are those 3 murders connected?" She leaned forward on her wooden chair, reached a hand down to her bag, then brought it back suddenly as though she'd changed her mind about something. "We didn't think so, at first, except that they're all unsolved. But someone noticed their names." She paused as though giving me a chance to interrupt her. Then she said, "Robin Callahan, J. Bradshaw, Ethan Bird." I thought for a moment. "I feel like I'm failing a test," I said. "You can take your time," she said. Or I can just tell you. Are their names related to birds? I said. She nodded. Right. A robin, a jay, and then the last name of Bird. It's kind of a stretch, I realize, but without going into too much detail, after each murder, the local police station closest to the crime received what appeared to be a message from the killer. So they are connected? It seems that way, yes. But they might be connected in another way as well. Do the murders remind you of anything? I'm asking you because you are someone who is an expert on detective fiction. I looked at the ceiling of my office for a moment, then said, I mean, it sounds like something fictional, like something from a serial killer novel or something from an Agatha Christie. She sat up a little straighter. Any particular Agatha Christie novel? The one that's jumping to my mind is A Pocket Full of Rye for some reason. Did that have birds? I don't know, but that's not the one I was thinking of. I guess it's similar to the ABC murders as well, I said. Agent Mulvey smiled like she'd just won a prize. Right, that's the one I'm thinking of. Because nothing connects the victims except for their names. Exactly. And not just that, but the deliveries to the police station. In the book, Poirot gets letters from the killer signed A, B, C. You've read it then? When I was 14, definitely. I read almost all of Agatha Christie's books, so I probably read that one too. It's one of her best, I said, after a brief pause. I'd never forgotten that particular Christie plotline. There are a series of murders, and what connects them are the victims' names. First, someone with the initials AA is killed in a town that begins with the letter A. Then, someone with the initials BB is killed in a B town. You get the idea. It turns out that the perpetrator really only wanted to kill one of the victims, but he made it look like a series of crimes done by a deranged serial killer. You think so? The agent said. I do. One of her best plots, for sure. I'm planning on reading it again, but I did just Wikipedia it to remind myself of the story. There was a fourth murder in the book as well. I think so, yes, I said. Someone with a D name was the last person killed, and it turned out that the killer was making it look like a madman was doing it when all along he just wanted to kill one person, so the other murders are basically cover. That's what the plot summary on Wikipedia said. In the book, it was the person with the double C name who was the intended victim all along. Okay, I said. I was starting to wonder why she had come to me. Was it just because I owned a mystery bookstore? Did she need a copy of the book? But if that were the case, then why did she ask for me specifically on the phone? If she just wanted someone who worked in a mystery bookstore, then she could have come inside and talked with anyone. Can you tell me anything else about the book? She asked, then added after a moment. You're the expert. Am I? I said. Not really, but what is it you want to know? I don't know. Anything. I was hoping you'd tell me. Well, besides the fact that a strange man comes into the store every day and buys a new copy of the ABC murders, I don't know what else to tell you. Her eyes raised for a moment before she realized I'd made a joke, or an attempt at one. Then she smiled a little in acknowledgement. I asked her, You think these murders are related to the book? I do, she said. It's too fantastical for it not to be. Is it that you think someone's copying the books in order to get away with a murder? That someone wanted to murder Robin Callahan, for example, but then murdered the other people to make it look like a serial killer obsessed with birds? Maybe, Agent Mulvey said, and she rubbed a finger along the edge of her nose, up near her left eye. Even her small hands were pale, the fingernails unpainted. She was quiet again. It was a strange interview, full of pauses. She was hoping I'd fill in the silence, I guess. I decided to not say anything. Eventually, she said, You must be wondering why I came to talk with you. I am, I said. Before I tell you, I'd like to ask you about one other recent case. Okay. You probably haven't heard of it. A man named Bill Manso. He was found near the train tracks in Norwalk, Connecticut, back in the spring. He was a regular commuter on a particular train, and initially it looked as though he'd jumped. But now it looks as though he was killed elsewhere and brought to the tracks. No, I said, shaking my head. I didn't hear about it. Does it remind you of anything? Does what remind me of anything? The nature of his death. No, I said, but that wasn't entirely true. It did remind me of something, but I couldn't remember exactly what it was. I don't think so, I added. She waited again, and I said, Do you want to tell me why you're questioning me? She unzipped her leather bag and removed a single sheet of paper. Do you remember a list you wrote for this store's blog back in 2004? A list called 8 Perfect Murders? Chapter 2. I'd worked in bookstores ever since graduating from college in 1999. First briefly at a Borders in downtown Boston, then as both an assistant manager and a senior manager at one of the few remaining independents in Harvard Square. Amazon had just won its war for total domination, and most of the indies were folding up like flimsy tents in a hurricane. But the Red Line bookstore was sticking it out, partly due to an older clientele not yet savvy enough to figure out online shopping, but mostly because its owner, Mort Abrams, outright owned the 2-story brick building the store was housed in and didn't have to pay rent. I was at Red Line 5 years, 2 as an assistant manager, then 3 as senior manager and part-time book buyer. My specialty was fiction, and in particular, crime fiction. During my time at the store, I also met my future wife, Claire Mallory, who was hired as a bookseller shortly after she dropped out of Boston University. We got married the same year that Mort Abrams lost his wife of 35 years to breast cancer. Mort and Sharon, who lived 2 streets over from the bookstore, had become close friends, substitute parents, really, and Sharon's death was hard, especially since it robbed Mort of any remaining zest for life. A year after her death, he told me that he was shutting down the store unless, of course, I wanted to buy him out, take it over myself. I considered it, but at that point Claire had already left Red Line, going to work at the local cable access station, and I didn't necessarily want to take on the hours or the financial risk of running my own store. I contacted Old Devils, a mystery bookstore in Boston, and John Haley, the owner at the time, created a job for me. I would be the events manager, but also create content for the store's burgeoning blog, a site for mystery lovers. My last day at Red Line was the store's last day in business as well. Mort and I locked the front doors together, then I followed him back to his office, where we drank from a dusty bottle of single malt that had been given to him by Robert Parker. I remember thinking that Mort, without his wife and now without the store, wouldn't make it through the winter. I was wrong. He lived through the winter and spring, but he did manage to die the following summer at his lake house at Winnipesaukee, a week before Claire and I were planning to visit. 8 Perfect Murders was the first piece I wrote for the Old Devils blog. John Haley, my new boss, had asked me to write a list of my favorite mystery novels, but instead I pitched the idea of writing a list of perfect murders in crime fiction. I don't exactly know why I was reluctant to share my favorite books yet, but I remember thinking that writing about perfect murders might generate more traffic. This was right around the time that several blogs were taking off, making their authors rich and famous. I remember someone doing a blog about making one of Julia Child's recipes every day that was turned into a book and maybe even a movie. I think I must have had some delusions of grandeur that my blog platform might turn me into a public and trusted aficionado of crime fiction. Claire added fuel to the fire by telling me repeatedly that she thought this blog could really blow up, that I'd find my calling, a literary critic of crime fiction. The truth was that I'd already found my calling, at least I thought I had, and I was a bookseller, content with the hundreds of minute interactions that make up a bookseller's daily life. And what I loved most of all was to read. That was my true calling. Despite this, I somehow began to see my Perfect Murders piece, not yet written, as more important than it really was. I'd be setting the tone for the blog, announcing myself to the world. I wanted it to be flawless, not just the writing, but the list itself. The books should be a mix of the well-known and the obscure. The Golden Age should be represented, but there should also be a contemporary novel. For days on end, I sweated it out, tinkering with the list, adding titles, subtracting titles, researching books I hadn't yet read. I think the only reason I ever actually finished was because John started to grumble that I hadn't published anything on the blog yet. "It's a blog," he'd said. "Just write a list of goddamn books and post it. You're not getting graded." The post went up, appropriately enough, on Halloween. Reading it now makes me cringe a little. It's overwritten, even pretentious at times. I can practically taste the need for approval. This is what was eventually posted. 8 Perfect Murders by Malcolm Kershaw. In the immortal words of Teddy Lewis in Body Heat, Lawrence Kasdan's underrated neo-noir from 1981, anytime you try a decent crime, you got 50 ways you're gonna fuck up. If you think of 25 of them, then you're a genius. And you ain't no genius. True words, yet the history of crime fiction is littered with criminals, mostly dead or incarcerated, who all attempted the near impossible, the perfect crime. And many of them attempted the ultimate perfect crime, that being murder. The following are my choices for the cleverest, the most ingenious, the most foolproof, if there is such a thing, murders in crime fiction history. These are not my favorite books in the genre, nor do I claim these are the best. They are simply the ones in which the murderer comes closest to realizing that platonic ideal of a perfect murder. So here it is, a personal list of perfect murders. I'll warn you in advance that while I try to avoid major spoilers, I wasn't 100% successful. If you haven't read one of these books and want to go in cold, I suggest reading the book first and my list second. The Red House Mystery, 1922, by A. Milne. Long before Alan Alexander Milne created his lasting legacy, Winnie the Pooh, in case you hadn't heard, he wrote one perfect crime novel. It's a country house mystery. A long-lost brother suddenly appears to ask Mark Ablett for money. A gun goes off in a locked room, and the brother is killed. Mark Ablett disappears. There is some preposterous trickery in this book, including characters in disguise and a secret passage. But the basic fundamentals behind the murderer's plan are extremely shrewd. Malice, Aforethought, 1931, by Anthony Berkeley Cox. Famous for being the first inverted crime novel, we know who the murderer and victim are on the very first page. This is essentially a case study in how to poison your wife and get away with it. It helps, of course, that the murderer is a country physician with access to lethal drugs. His insufferable wife is merely his first victim, because once you commit a perfect murder, the temptation is to try another one. The ABC Murders, 1936, by Agatha Christie. Poirot is investigating a madman who, it appears, is alphabetically obsessed, killing off Alice Asher in Andover, followed by Betty Barnard in Bexhill, etc. This is the textbook example of hiding one specific premeditated murder among a host of others, hoping that the detectives will suspect the work of a lunatic. Double Indemnity, 1943, by James M. Cain. This is my favorite Cain, mostly because of the grim, fatalistic ending. But the murder at the center of the book, an insurance agent plots with femme fatale Phyllis Nerdlinger to off her husband, is brilliantly executed. It's a classic staged murder. The husband is killed in a car, then placed on the train tracks to make it look as though he fell off the smoking car at the rear of the train. Walter Huff, her insurance agent lover, impersonates the husband on the train, ensuring that witnesses will attest to the murdered man's presence. Strangers on a Train, 1950, by Patricia Highsmith. My pick for the most ingenious of them all. Two men, each with someone they want dead, plan to swap murders, ensuring that the other has an alibi at the time of the murder. Because there is zero connection between the two men, they briefly talk on a train, the murders become unsolvable. In theory, of course. And Highsmith, despite the brilliance of the plot, was more interested in the ideas of coercion and guilt, of one man exerting his will on the other. The finished novel is both fascinating and rotten to the core, like most of Highsmith's oeuvre. The Drowner, 1963, by John MacDonald. MacDonald, my choice for underrated master of mid-century crime fiction, rarely dabbled in whodunits. He was far too interested in the criminal mind to keep his villains hidden until the end. The Drowner is an outlier, then, and a good one. The killer devises a way to drown his or her victims so that it looks exactly like an accident. Deathtrap, 1978, by Ira Levin. Not a novel, of course, but a play, although I highly recommend reading it, along with seeking out the excellent 1982 film. You'll never look at Christopher Reeve in the same way again. It's a brilliant, funny stage thriller that manages to be both the genuine article and a satirical one at the same time. The first murder, a wife with a weak heart, is clever in its construction, but also foolproof. Heart attacks are a natural death, even when they aren't. The Secret History, 1992, by Donna Tartt. Like Malice, Aforethought, another inverted murder mystery in which a small cadre of classics students at a New England university kill one of their own. We know the who long before we know the why. The murder itself is simple in its execution. Bunny Corcoran is pushed into a ravine during his traditional Sunday hike. What makes it stand out is ringleader Henry Winter's explanation of the crime. That they are allowing Bunny to choose the circumstances of his own death. They are not even sure of his planned route for that day, but wait at a likely spot, wanting to make the death seem random instead of designed. What follows is a chilling exploration of remorse and guilt. Truth is, it was a hard list to put together. I thought it would be easier to come up with examples of perfect murders in fiction, but it just wasn't. That's why I included Deathtrap, even though it's a play and not a book. I'd actually never even read Ira Levin's original script or even seen it on stage. I was just a fan of the film. Also, looking back on the list now, it's clear that The Drowner, a book I really do love, doesn't quite belong here. The murderer lurks at the bottom of a pond with an oxygen tank, then pulls her victim down into the depths. It's a fun concept, but highly unlikely and hardly foolproof. How does she know where to wait? What if someone else is at the pond? I suppose that once pulled off, it is a crime that truly looks like an accident, but I think I just put the book on the list because of how much I love John D. MacDonald. I suppose I also wanted something slightly obscure, something that hadn't been turned into a movie. After I posted it, Claire told me she loved the writing, and John, my boss, was just relieved that the blog had been started. I waited for comments to appear, allowing myself brief fantasies in which the piece would start an online frenzy, blog readers chiming in to argue about their own favorite murders. NPR would call and ask me to come on air to discuss the very topic. In the end, the blog piece got 2 comments. The first came from a Sue Snowden who wrote, "Wow, now I have so many new books to add to my pile." And the second came from F. Folliot123 who wrote, "Anyone who writes a list of perfect murders that doesn't have at least one John Dixon Carr on it obviously knows nothing about anything." Now, the thing about John Dixon Carr is that I just can't get into those books, even though the commenter was probably right in calling out their absence. Carr specialized in locked room murder mysteries, impossible crimes. It seems ridiculous now, but at the time I was bothered by the opinion, probably because I agreed with it to a certain degree. I even considered a follow-up post, maybe something like 8 more perfect murders. Instead, my next post was a list of my favorite mystery novels from the previous year, and I wrote the entire thing in about an hour. I also figured out how to link the titles of the books to our online store, and for that, John was extremely grateful. "We're just trying to sell books here, Mal," he'd said. "Not trying to start arguments." Chapter 3. Agent Mulvey was holding a printed-out sheet of paper. I took it from her, glanced down at the list I'd written, then said, "I remember this, but it was a long time ago." "Do you remember the books you picked?" I glanced down at the printout again, my eyes going immediately to Double Indemnity, and suddenly I knew why she was here. "Oh," I said. "The man on the train tracks. You think that's based on Double Indemnity?" "I think it could be, sure. He was a regular commuter. Even though he'd been killed elsewhere, it was made to look like he'd jumped off the train. When I heard about it, it made me immediately think of Double Indemnity. The movie, anyway. I haven't read the book." "And you're coming to me because I've read the book?" I said. She blinked rapidly, then shook her head. "No, I'm coming to you because when I realized that maybe this crime was mimicking a movie or a book, I did a Google search that included Double Indemnity and the ABC murders together. And that's how I found your list." She was watching me expectantly, making eye contact, and I felt my own eyes skidding away from hers, taking in the large expanse of her forehead, her nearly invisible eyebrows. "Am I a suspect?" I said, then laughed. She leaned back a little in her chair. "You're not an official suspect, no. If that were the case, then it wouldn't just be me here questioning you. But I am investigating the possibility that all these crimes were committed by the same perpetrator, and that that perpetrator is purposefully mimicking crimes from your list." "Mine can't be the only list that includes both Double Indemnity and the ABC murders." "To tell the truth, it pretty much is. Well, yours is the shortest list that contains them both. Both books were on other lists together, but those lists were all much longer. Like there was one called 100 Mysteries You Need to Read Before You Die, that sort of thing. But yours jumped out. It's about committing the perfect murder. 8 books are mentioned. You work at a mystery bookstore in Boston. All the crimes have happened in New England. Look, I know it's probably all a coincidence, but I thought it was worth following up." I get that it's somewhat clear someone is copycatting the ABC murders, but a body found near the train tracks? That seems a stretch to say that's from Double Indemnity. "Do you remember the book well?" "I do. It's one of my favorites." This was true. I'd read Double Indemnity around the age of 13 and was so thrilled by it that I sought out the film version with Fred MacMurray and Barbara Stanwyck that was made in 1944. That film led me down a rabbit hole of film noirs. My teenage years spent seeking out video stores that stocked classic film. Of all the noirs I saw because of Double Indemnity, none of them topped that first viewing experience. Sometimes I think the Miklos Rosa score to that movie is permanently embedded in my brain. On the day that Bill Manso's body was found on the tracks, one of the emergency windows on the train had been busted open, near to where the body was found. So is it possible he really did jump? Not a chance. The scene of crime officers could tell that he'd been killed in a separate location and driven to the tracks. And the coroner confirmed that he'd died from blunt force trauma to the head, probably from some kind of weapon. Okay, I said. That means that someone, probably the person who killed him or an accomplice, was on the train and smashed the emergency window to make it look like he'd jumped. For the first time since we'd started talking, I felt a little jolt of alarm. In the book, and the movie as well, an insurance agent falls for the wife of an oil executive, and together they plot to murder him. They do it for each other, but also for the money. The insurance agent, Walter Huff, fakes an accident policy on Nerdlinger, the man they plan to murder. Included in the policy is a double indemnity clause that doubles the amount of the payoff if death occurs on a train. Walter and Phyllis, the unfaithful wife, break the husband's neck in a car. Then Walter poses as Nerdlinger and goes onto the train himself. He wears a fake cast on his leg and has crutches, since the real Nerdlinger had recently broken his leg. He figures that the cast is perfect because other passengers will remember seeing him, but not necessarily remember seeing his face. He goes to the smoking car at the back of the train and jumps off. Then Walter and Phyllis leave the dead man by the tracks, so it looks as though he fell. So, you're saying it was definitely made to look like the murder from Double Indemnity? I said. I am, she responded. I'm the only one, though. The only one who's convinced of the connection. What were these people like? I asked. The people who were killed. Agent Mulvey glanced toward the drop ceiling of the bookstore's back room, then said, As far as we can tell, there's no way to connect them. Besides the fact that all the deaths happened in New England, and besides the fact that they seem to be copycat murders from fictional sources. From my list, I said. Right. Your list is one possible connection. But there's also a connection. It's not really a connection, more of a gut feeling on my part. That all the victims weren't bad, exactly, but weren't good people. I'm not sure any of them were really well liked. I thought for a moment. It was getting darker in the back room of the bookstore, and I instinctively checked my watch, but it was still early afternoon. I looked back toward the stockroom where 2 windows looked out onto the back alley. Snow had begun to pile in both of them, and the portion of outside that I could make out through the windows was as dark as dusk. I turned on my desk lamp. For example, she continued, Bill Manso was a divorced investment broker. The detectives who interviewed his grown children said they hadn't seen him in over 2 years, that he wasn't exactly the paternal type. It was clear that they disliked him. And Robin Callahan, as you've probably read, had been pretty controversial. Remind me, I said. I guess a number of years ago she broke up a marriage of one of her coworkers, and subsequently her own marriage. Then she wrote a book against monogamy. This was a while ago. A lot of people don't like her. If you Google her name... Well, I said. Right, everyone has enemies now. But to answer your question, I think it's a possibility that everyone who has been killed so far was a less than stellar person. You think that someone read my list of murders, I said, then decided to copy the methods in them? And they wanted to make sure that the people they were killing somehow deserved to die. Is that your theory? She pushed her lips together, making them even more colorless than they already were. Then she said, I know it sounds ridiculous. Or you think that I wrote this list and then decided to test out the murders for myself? Equally ridiculous, she said. I know it is. But it's also unlikely, isn't it, that someone would copy a plot line from an Agatha Christie novel, and at the same time someone would stage a train murder from a James Cain novel? I said. Right, she said. My desk lamp has a yellow-tinged bulb, and in the glow from it she looked like she hadn't slept in about 3 days. When did you make the connection between these crimes? I asked. You mean, when did I find your list? I guess so, yes. Yesterday. I've already ordered all the books, and I've read all their plot summaries. But then I decided I'd come directly to you. I was hoping you might have some insight, that maybe you'd be able to connect some other unsolved recent crimes to your list. I know it's a long shot. I was looking down at the printout she'd given me, reminding myself of the 8 books I'd picked. Some of these, I said, you couldn't exactly copy the murders from them. Or you could, but they'd be hard to spot. What do you mean? She said. I scanned the list. Deathtrap, the play by Ira Levin. Do you know that one? I do, but remind me. The way the wife gets killed is that she's scared to death and has a heart attack. It's set up by the husband and his boyfriend. It's a perfect murder, of course, because you could never prove that someone who's had a heart attack was actually murdered. But let's say someone wanted to replicate it. First of all, it's pretty hard to give someone a heart attack, and it would be even harder for you to figure it out. I don't suppose you've found a suspicious heart attack victim, have you? I actually have, she said, and for the first time since she'd arrived at the store, I saw a gleam of self-satisfaction in her eye. She really did believe she was onto something. I don't know much about it, she continued. But there was a woman named Elaine Johnson from Rockland, Maine, who died of a heart attack in her home last September. She had a heart condition, so it looked like a natural death, but there were signs that her home had been broken into. I rubbed at my earlobe. Like a robbery? That's what the police decided. Someone broke into her home to rob it or to assault her, but she had a heart attack as soon as she saw the housebreaker. So they took off. Nothing was taken from the house? Right. Nothing was taken from the house. I don't know, I said. Think about it, though, she said, moving a little forward in her chair. Let's say you wanted to murder someone by causing a heart attack. First of all, you pick a victim who's already had one, which, in this case, Elaine Johnson had. Then you sneak into her house, where she lives alone, put on some sort of horrifying disguise, and leap out at her from a closet. She drops dead, and you've committed murder, just like in your book. And if it doesn't work? Then the murderer bolts from the house, and she can't identify them. But she'd report it. Of course. Did anyone report something like that happening to them? No, at least not that I know of. But that only means that it worked the first time. Right, I said. She was quiet for a moment. I heard the ticking sound that meant Nero was coming toward us along the hardwood floor. Agent Mulvey, who heard it as well, turned and looked at the store cat. She let him sniff her hand, then expertly rubbed his head. Nero sunk to the floor and flipped onto his side, purring. You must have cats, I said. 2. Does this one go home with you, or does he just stay in the store? He just stays here. For him, the entire universe is 2 book-lined rooms and a series of strangers, a few of whom feed him. Sounds like a good life, she said. I think he does all right. Half the people who come in here just come to see him. Nero stood back up, stretched out his hind legs, one at a time, and walked back toward the front of the store. So what is it that you want from me? I said. Well, if someone really is using your list as a guide for committing murders, then you're the expert. I don't know about that. I mean, you're the expert on the books on your list. They're favorite books of yours. I guess, I said. I wrote that list a long time ago, and some of those books I know a lot better than others. Still, it can't hurt to get your opinion. I was hoping you'd look at some cases I put together, a list of unsolved murders in the New England region over the last few years. I threw it together quickly last night, just summaries, really. She was pulling a stapled sheaf of papers from her briefcase. "And was hoping you'd go through them. Let me know if any of them seem like they might have something to do with the books on your list." "Sure," I said, taking the pages from her. "Are these classified as well?" "Most of the information I've summarized is public information. If any of the crimes strike you as a possibility, I'll take a closer look. I'm just fishing here with these ones, honestly. I've already gone over them. It's just that since you've read the books—" "I'll need to reread some of the books as well," I said. "So you'll help me?" She sat up a little straighter and half smiled. She had a short upper lip, and I could see her gums when she opened her mouth. "I'll try," I said. "Thank you. And there's one more thing. I've ordered all the books, but if you had any copies here, I could get a quicker start on them." I checked the inventory on the computer. It told me we had several copies each of Double Indemnity, the ABC Murders, and The Secret History, plus one copy of The Red House Mystery. We also had one copy of Strangers on a Train, but it was a first edition from 1950 in perfect condition that was worth at least $1,000. We had a locked case near the checkout counter that held all our books that were worth $50 or more, but it wasn't there. It was in my office, also in a locked glass case, where I put the editions of books that I wasn't quite ready to part with yet. There was a collector's streak in me, not necessarily a good thing for someone who worked in a bookstore, and for someone whose own bookshelves in my attic apartment were filled to capacity. I nearly told Agent Mulvey that we didn't have the Highsmith book, but decided that I shouldn't lie, at least not about something trivial, to an employee of the FBI. I told her what it was worth, and she said she'd wait for her paperback copy to arrive. That left The Drowner, which I definitely had at home, and Malice Aforethought, which I thought I might have at home as well. I definitely didn't have a copy of the play script for Deathtrap, either here at the store or at home, but I did know that it existed. I told the agent all this. "I can't read 8 books in a night anyway," she said. "Are you going back to—" "I'm staying near here tonight, at the Flat of the Hill Hotel. I was hoping after you looked over the list, maybe in the morning, we could meet again, see if you've had any thoughts." "Of course," I said. "I don't know if I'll be opening the store tomorrow, not if this weather—" "You could come to the hotel. The FBI will pay for your breakfast." "Sounds fine," I said. At the front door, Agent Mulvey said she'd pay for the books she was taking home with her. "Don't worry about it," I said. "You can return them to me when you're done." "Thank you," she said. She opened the door just as a gust of wind ricocheted down Berry Street. The snow was piling up, the wind causing drifts, obliterating all the sharp angles of the city street. "Be careful out there," I said. "It's not far," she said. "Tomorrow at 10, right?" she added, confirming the time for our breakfast meeting. "Right," I said, and stood in the doorway, watching her disappear into the enveloping snow. Chapter 4. I lived alone on the other side of Charles Street, up the hill in a brownstone attic apartment that was rented to me by a 90-year-old Boston Brahmin who had no idea of the actual worth of her property. I paid a scandalously low rent and fretted selfishly about the day my landlady would die and pass her property on to one of her more financially astute sons. It normally took me less than 10 minutes to get from the bookstore to my apartment, but I was walking against the storm in a pair of shoes with worn-out treads. The snow stung my face, and the wind was bending trees and singing down the empty streets. On Charles, I considered checking to see if the Sevens was open for a drink, but decided to pop into the cheese and wine shop instead, where I bought myself a 6-pack of Old Speckled Hen and a pre-made ham and cheese baguette for my dinner. I had been planning on cooking the pork chop that I'd taken out to defrost that morning, but I was anxious to read through Agent Mulvey's list that night. At my apartment building, I climbed the unshoveled steps to the heavy front door, made from walnut and with cast-iron door handles. I let myself in after knocking the snow from my shoes. Another tenant, probably Mary Ann, had already sorted the mail and left it on the side table in the foyer. I picked up my damp credit card solicitations while I dripped onto the cracked tile floor, then climbed the 3 flights of stairs to my converted attic space. As always during the winter months, it was stiflingly hot inside my place. I removed my jacket and sweater, then opened both my windows, one on either side of the slanted walls, just enough so that cold air could seep in. I put 5 of the beers into my fridge and cracked the 6th. Even though my apartment was a studio, there was enough space for a clearly delineated living room, and I stretched out on the sofa, put my feet up on the coffee table, and began to read through Agent Mulvey's list. It was organized chronologically, every entry formatted the same way, the header specifying the date, the location, and the name of the victim. Even though it was a summary, dashed off at the last minute, it was composed of complete sentences and read like textbook journalism. Agent Mulvey had probably never received less than an A in her entire academic career. I wondered what had attracted her to the FBI. She came across as someone more suited to academia, an English professor, maybe, or a researcher. She reminded me a little of Emily Barsamian, my extremely bookish employee who couldn't look me in the eye when we talked. Agent Mulvey wasn't quite that awkward, just young and inexperienced, maybe. It was impossible for me not to think of Clarice Starling, another bird name, from The Silence of the Lambs. It was where my mind almost always went, to books and movies. It had been that way since I first began to read. And Mulvey, like her fictional counterpart, seemed too tame for the job. It was hard to imagine her whipping a gun from a holster or aggressively questioning a suspect. She did question a suspect, though. She questioned you. I pushed that particular thought out of my head, drank some beer, and looked at her list, scanning the items before settling down to read the details. I knew right away that there wasn't much here. At least nothing obvious was jumping out. Many of the unsolved murders were gun crimes, young people in cities mostly. One of the victims of gun violence sounded like a possibility, but there wasn't much detail in the description. A man named Daniel Gonzalez had been gunned down while taking his dog for a walk in the Middlesex Fells. It had happened early in the morning the previous September, and Agent Mulvey made a note that there were currently no leads in the case. The only reason this particular crime jumped out at me was because of the murder in The Secret History. The college-aged murderers in Donna Tartt's book decide that they need to get rid of their friend, Bunny Corcoran, fearful that he will reveal what he knows about a previous murder when the classics students had emulated a Dionysian bacchanal in the woods and accidentally, or not, killed a farmer. Bunny had not been part of the ritual, but he finds out about it and begins to leverage this information to get things, dinners out, trips to Italy, from his wealthy friends. They also worry he'll drunkenly tell someone about what took place. Because of this, they plot to murder him. Henry Winter, the smartest of the group of students, finalizes their plan. They know that Bunny takes long walks on Sunday afternoon, and they lie in wait at a place where they think he might wind up, a trail above a deep ravine. When he arrives, they shove him off the edge, hoping it will look like an accident, hoping that the randomness of Bunny's walk will hide the design of the murder. Could the case of Daniel Gonzalez, killed while on his morning run, possibly be related? The fact that he was shot made it seem unlikely, but maybe the idea behind this copycat murder was to take someone out while he was doing a predictable activity. I got my laptop and looked up his obituary. He had been an adjunct professor at a local community college, teaching Spanish. While it wasn't Latin or Greek, he was a languages professor. It was a possibility, and I decided to tell Agent Mulvey about it the following morning. I went through the rest of the crimes. I was particularly looking for a drowning, thinking of John D. MacDonald's book, The Drowner. But, of course, if someone were drowned in such a way as to make it look like an accident, then it probably wouldn't make a list of unsolved murders. There were also no listings for accidental overdoses. That was the method of killing in Malice, Aforethought. The murderer, a doctor, turns his wife into a morphine addict. Then it is simply a matter of making sure other people know about her addiction, that it becomes local gossip. Then he kills her with an overdose. Of course, there must have been hundreds, if not thousands, of drug overdoses in New England the past few years. Could one of those have been an intentional murder? The thing about my list was that when I originally created it, I really was trying to come up with murders that were so clever that the perpetrator would never be caught. With that in mind, if someone successfully copycatted some of these murders, they'd be undetectable. I ate 2 bites of my sandwich, then had another beer. The apartment was too quiet, and I didn't want to turn on the television, so I played music instead. Max Richter's 24 postcards in full color. I lay back on my sofa and looked up at the high ceiling, at a thin crack that zigzagged out from under the molding. It was a familiar sight, that ceiling. I thought about what I'd tell Agent Mulvey the next morning at breakfast. I'd tell her about Daniel Gonzalez, of course, and how it might be related to the secret history. I'd suggest that she research accidental drownings, especially ones that happened in ponds or lakes, and I would also suggest that she look into overdose deaths, especially ones in which the deceased used a syringe. The album ended, and I restarted it, lying back down on the sofa. My mind was going in many different directions, so I decided to slow down and make a mental list. I told myself to list assumptions first. Assumption number 1 was that someone was using my list to murder random people. Well, maybe not random. Maybe the victims somehow deserved to die, at least according to the murderer. Assumption number 2 was that while I was probably a suspect, I was in no way a serious suspect. As Agent Mulvey herself pointed out, she wouldn't have come alone had that been the case. The purpose of her interview that afternoon had been to feel me out, try to get a sense of me. If she thought I was involved, I decided that the next time we met, breakfast tomorrow or sometime after that, she would be with another FBI agent. Assumption number 3, whoever is doing this isn't just using my list. The killer knows me. Maybe not a lot, but a little. The reason I thought that, the reason I knew that, is because the 5th victim that Agent Mulvey mentioned, the woman who had the heart attack at her house in Rockland, Elaine Johnson. Thing is, I actually knew her. Not well, but as soon as I heard the name, I knew that it was the same Elaine Johnson who used to live in Beacon Hill, a frequent customer at the bookstore, and a woman who came to every author reading we ever hosted. I knew I should have told Agent Mulvey this at the time, but I didn't, and until I felt I had to, I didn't plan on telling her. I was sure she was withholding information from me, so I planned on withholding this information from her. I had to begin to protect myself. Chapter 5. I was beginning to fall asleep on the sofa, so I got up, rinsed out the beer bottles, threw away the remainder of my sandwich, brushed my teeth, and changed into my pajamas. Then I went to my bookshelf and found the book I was looking for, The Drowner. I had the original gold medal paperback, printed in 1963. It had one of those lurid illustrated covers that adorn pretty much all of John D. MacDonald's mid-century paperbacks. On this one, a dark-haired woman in a white bikini is being pulled down through the murky green depths by a pair of hands, gripping one of her pretty legs. It promised, like all these covers, 2 things: sex and death. I ran my thumb along the edge of the book, riffling the pages, and that musty, prickly smell of an old paperback reached my nostrils. I've always loved that smell, even though the book collector side of me knew that it was a sign of a book that had been improperly maintained over the years, a book that had probably sat in a cardboard box on the floor of a damp cellar for too many seasons. But to me, the smell took me instantly back to the Annie's book swap where I began to buy books when I was in the 6th grade. I grew up in Milne, about 45 minutes west of Boston. The year that I turned 11 was also the year that I was allowed to ride my bike the 1.5 miles along Dartford Road into Middleham's town center. There were only 3 stores, a convenience store that called itself Middleham General, in an attempt to sound like something quainter than what it was, an antiques shop located in the old post office building, and an Annie's Book Swap, a franchised used bookstore run by an Englishman named Anthony Blake. It sold primarily mass markets, those paperbacks that could just about fit in a back pocket, and it was there that I bought the Ian Fleming novels and the Peter Benchleys and the Agatha Christies that got me through my younger years. It was there that I almost definitely bought The Drowner, having already purchased every available Travis McGee book, John D. MacDonald's famous series. It was rare to find MacDonald standalones, but some devoted crime reader in my part of Massachusetts must have died around the time I started riding my bike to the town center, because Annie's was suddenly swamped with stacks of pulp novels, not just John D. MacDonald, but Mickey Spillane books, and Alistair MacLean's and Ed McBain's 87th Precinct novels. I allowed myself 3 books per shopping expedition, which just about used up my allowance. In those days, it took me less than a week to read those 3 books. Sometimes it took me just 3 days. But I was always happy to reread books I already owned. I probably hadn't read The Drowner since then, since I was a preteen, but the basic plot had stuck with me. The villain, and she was a good one, was a highly religious secretary who sublimated all her repressed sexual energy into physical exercise. She murdered the sinful people around her, including a married woman having an affair with her boss. She drowned her by lurking in scuba gear at the bottom of the pond where this woman swam. Then she got hold of one of her legs and pulled her down under the water. That particular murder I never forgot. When I made up my perfect murders list, it had jumped into my mind. I didn't reread the book, but I familiarized myself with it. I brought The Drowner into bed with me. I read the first paragraph, its words hauntingly familiar. Books are time travel. True readers all know this. But books don't just take you back to the time in which they were written. They can take you back to different versions of yourself. The last time I'd cracked this particular paperback, I was probably 11 or 12. I like to think it was summertime, and I was up late in my cramped bedroom under a single sheet, a mosquito probably whining in one of the corners of the room. My father was playing his records in the living room, too loudly, depending on how drunk he was. Most nights ended the same, with my mother turning down his music, jazz usually, although sometimes he'd listen to fusion stuff like Frank Zappa or Weather Report, and my father berating her for not understanding him. But this was simply background noise, because I wasn't really there in that bedroom. I was actually in Florida in 1963, hanging out with shady real estate developers and sexy divorcees and drinking bourbon highballs. And now, here I was again, almost 40 years old, and my eyes were running over the same words, holding the same book I held 28 years ago, the same book some businessman or housewife held 50 years ago. Time travel. I finished the book at about 4 a.m. I almost got out of bed to get another book from the list, but decided to try and sleep instead. I rolled onto my stomach, thinking about the book, about what it must feel like to be swimming along in a pond when something grabs you from below, pulls you down to your death. Then, because I was starting to get sleepy, my wife's face came into my mind, as it always did. But I didn't dream of her, and I didn't dream about the drowner. I dreamed about running, about people coming after me. The same dream I have every night of my life. It was still snowing when I left my apartment in the morning, but it was a light, drifting snow, half of it kicked up by a wind that was still gusting. There was about 2 feet already on the ground. The roads had been plowed, but no one had been out yet to shovel the sidewalks, so I walked in the middle of the street, careful going down the steep hill to Charles. Even though the skies were blanketed in clouds, the day was bright, maybe from all that pristine snow. I carried my old bike messenger bag, its strap over my shoulder. I got to the hotel early. The Flat of the Hill was a recent addition to my part of Boston, a boutique hotel inside a refurbished warehouse just off Charles. It had a high-end restaurant and a pretty bar that I occasionally went to on Monday nights when oysters were $1 each. "I'm meeting someone for breakfast," I said to the lone employee, a sad-eyed woman behind the check-in desk, and she directed me past the bar into a small dining area with about 8 tables. There was no one there to seat me, so I sat myself at a corner table by a large window that looked out onto a wall of brick. I was the only one in the room, and I wondered if anyone was actually working there, or if all the staff were unable to make it to work because of the snowstorm. Then, simultaneously, a man in a crisp white shirt and black pants pushed through a pair of swinging doors, while Agent Mulvey appeared at the entrance to the dining room. She spotted me and came over, just as the waiter was dropping off menus. We both ordered coffee and juice. "The FBI has a decent travel budget," I said. She looked confused for a moment, then said, "Oh, I booked this place myself because it was close to your store. Who knows if they'll reimburse me?" "How'd you sleep?" I asked. She had dark purple shadows under her eyes. "Very little. I was reading." "Me too. What book did you read?" "The Red House Mystery. I thought I'd start at the beginning." "What did you think?" I said, and took a sip of my coffee, scalding the tip of my tongue. "It was good. Clever, I guess, and I didn't guess the ending." She touched the side of her porcelain coffee cup, then leaned down, pursing her lips, and sipped a little bit from the top. The maneuver made me think of a bird. "Honestly," I said, "I know I included it on my list, but I don't remember the exact details. I read it a long time ago." "It's pretty much how you described it. It's a country house mystery that is kind of ludicrous. I kept thinking about Clue, the game." "Colonel Mustard in the library." "Exactly, but it was better than that." She described to me the basic plot, and it started to come back. There's a rich man named Mark Ablett who lives in a country house, the kind of English one that seems specifically designed to have a murder occur in it. He gets a letter from his estranged, no-good brother saying he's coming to visit from Australia. When the brother arrives, he's told to wait in the study for Mark Ablett. Then a shot is heard. The brother from Australia is dead, and Mark Ablett is missing. It seems clear that Mark has killed his own brother and fled. The detective in the story is actually just a passing acquaintance of one of the country estate's guests. His name is Tony Gillingham, and together with his friend Bill, they begin to investigate. It turns out that there is a secret tunnel that runs from the study underneath the house and all the way out to a golf course, and there are, of course, multiple suspects. "There's no brother, right?" I said, interrupting her. "Right, exactly. The real brother died years ago and isn't part of the present action. Mark Ablett had been talked into impersonating him, and then he's killed. But that wasn't the part of the murder that I found clever. Did you?" She was talking fast, and only after she paused did I realize that she was expecting an answer. "I think I put it on the list because the murderer had basically provided a corpse and a killer at the same time. They were the same person, but only the killer knew that.
"Can I read a section I underlined last night?"
"Sure," I said, and she pulled the paperback from her bag and began flipping through pages. I could see from where I was seated that she'd underlined several passages. I thought of my wife, the way she would always read with a pen in her hand, ready to write in whatever book she was reading. I was suddenly glad I hadn't given Agent Mulvey the expensive first edition of Strangers on a Train.
"Okay, got it,"
she said, flattening the book on the table and leaning forward to read.
"The inspector had arrived in it, the house I think he's talking about, to find a man dead and a man missing," she began. "It was extremely probable, no doubt, that the missing man had shot the dead man. But it was more than extremely probable. It was almost certain that the inspector would start with the idea that this extremely probable solution was the one true solution, and that, in consequence, he would be less disposed to consider without prejudice any other solution."
She finished reading and closed the book.
"It's got me thinking," she continued. "If you were going to commit a murder based on this book, how would you do it?"
I must have looked confused because she added,
"Would you shoot someone in the study of a country house?"
"No," I said. "I guess I would kill 2 people, then hide one of the bodies, and make it look as though the killer has gone on the run."
"Exactly," she said.
The waiter was hovering, so we both ordered. Agent Mulvey got the eggs Florentine. I wasn't hungry, but ordered 2 poached eggs on toast with fresh fruit on the side. After we ordered, she said,
"This has me thinking about rules."
"What do you mean, rules?"
"Okay," she said, and thought for a moment. "If I was the one who had set myself this task, this goal of committing the 8 murders that you described in your list, then it would be helpful to set some guidelines, some rules. Do you copy the murders exactly, or the idea behind the murders? How similar do they have to be?"
"So you think the rules dictate that the murderer adheres as closely as possible to the actual murders in the book?"
"No, not the details of the murders, but the philosophies behind them. It's almost as though the murderer is testing these books in real life. If the idea was simply to mimic the books, then you could just shoot someone in a country house library and call it a day. Or for the ABC murders, you'd actually copy them exactly. You know, find someone named Abby Adams who lived in Acton and kill her first, etc. But it's not just about that. It's about doing them right. There are rules."
"So for the Red House mystery, it's all about pointing the police toward a suspect that they will never find and never get to question."
"Yes, exactly," Agent Mulvey said. "It actually is clever. I was thinking about it all last night. Let's say I wanted to kill someone. My ex-boyfriend, for example."
"Okay," I said.
"If I just killed him, then I would be a suspect. But let's say I killed 2 people, like my ex-boyfriend and my ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend, say, and made sure that the body of the new girlfriend wasn't found. That way, I could make it look like the killer had run away. The police wouldn't be looking for the identity of the killer. They'd think they already knew it."
"It wouldn't be easy, you know," I said.
"Huh," she said. "I wasn't really considering it."
"Because the killer would have to be willing to kill 2 people."
"Right."
"And hiding a body is not easy."
"You're not speaking from experience, are you?" she said.
"I've read a lot of mystery novels."
"I think I need to look for a crime in which the prime suspect has disappeared."
"Is that common?" I asked.
"It isn't, really. It's not so easy to disappear these days. Most people leave pretty obvious trails. But it happens."
"I think you're on to something," I said. "It might be a matter of looking for 2 deserving victims, criminals, maybe, one of whom died and one who disappeared. That is, if your theory's correct, that... What should we call our suspect? We should have a name."
Why don't we call him—" She paused.
"Something with a bird."
"No, that's confusing. Let's call him Charlie," she said.
"Why Charlie?"
"It just popped into my head. No, that's not true. I was trying to think of a name, and I thought of copycat, which made me think of a cat, which made me think of my first cat when I was young, and his name was Charlie."
"Poor Charlie. Does he deserve to have his name used this way?"
"He does, actually. He was a total killer. Brought us a mouse or a bird every day."
"Perfect," I said.
"Charlie it is."
So, what was I saying? Right, look for deserving pairs of victims. Charlie doesn't like to kill innocent people.
"We don't know that for a fact, but it's a possibility," she said, pushing herself a little back from the table to allow her food to be put in front of her. "Thank you," she said to the waiter, then picked up a fork. "Mind if I eat and talk? I skipped dinner last night and I'm starving."
"No, that's fine," I said.
My poached eggs had arrived, and the sight of them, the edges of the whites slightly translucent, made my stomach flip.
I speared a cube of cantaloupe on the end of my fork.
"And maybe I'm wrong," Agent Mulvey said, when she was done chewing her first bite of breakfast. "This could have something to do with you, of course. Someone trying to get your attention. Maybe someone trying to frame you?" She opened her eyes a little wider as she said this. I jutted out my lower lip as though thinking about the possibility.
"And if that's the case," I finally said, "then it makes sense to ensure that the murders have obviously been based on the books on the list."
"Right," she said. "That's why I want to look more closely at what happened to Elaine Johnson, the heart attack victim."
"Who might or might not have been killed by Charlie," I said.
"But if she was, then I need to go to the crime scene. There might be something that connects it to Deathtrap."
"I have a confession to make," I said, and watched as Agent Mulvey's cheeks reddened in anticipation. "I haven't actually ever seen the play or even read it, but I have seen the movie, and I'm pretty sure that it's very faithful. Anyway, I'm embarrassed."
"You should be,"
she said, but laughed. Her face was no longer red. "So, in the movie, all I can actually talk about," I said, "the victim dies of a heart attack when she sees a man she thinks is dead loom up in her bedroom and murder her husband. Was Elaine Johnson found dead in her bedroom?"
"I'll have to check," she said. "I can't remember offhand. You know, when you said you had a confession, I thought you were going to say something else."
"You thought I was going to confess to being Charlie?" I said, in what I hoped was a flippant way.
"No," she said. "I thought you were going to confess to me that you knew Elaine Johnson,